correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to Me and Steve Talk RPG, the podcast where me and my friend Steve try and help you get the most out of your role-playing game experience.
Welcome back to Me and Steve Talk RPGs. I'm here with my friend Steve.
Hello.
And we have another D20 Podcast Network host. From the Table Flip podcast, we have Micah on this week. So why don't you go ahead and shout out your podcast?
Yeah, hey folks, this is Micah, aka FatCrab, here, host of Table Flip Podcast, co-host of Table Flip Podcast, I should say. I also have co-hosted my own on that, Tyler and Lindsay. If you recognize my voice, you probably recognize their voice. Anyway, hi folks.
So tell us a little bit about Table Flip. I know I was listening to your initial live play today, actually, because I kept meaning to and forgot, and then went, I'm talking to him tonight. I should at least be somewhat familiar.
That's fair. Well, one, I hope you're enjoying the initial live play. The audio quality, mic quality issues aside, that was actually put a lot of energy into doing the backtracking and sound effects for that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so the concept of Table Flip is that we want to explore every setting on the Genesys Foundry marketplace. So we have been going in chronological order of release, so that might change a little bit, but we're going to go through every setting. That's the intent. And we talk a little bit about the setting, we make characters for the setting and discuss it, and then we do an actual session of actual play in that respective setting with 1 to 2 public players from the community Discord server. And then after that, we do an interview with the author or one of the authors of the setting. So we've talked to Sam Gregor Stewart so far. We've had a chat with GM Phil. We've had a conversation with Scott Zumwalt and Guillaume Tardif. And I think that's it, though I feel like... Oh, and Chris Witt, GM Chris. And that's it so far. But we'll continue to sort of slog through and... not slog. It's actually been really fun, but we'll continue to frolic through and keep recording setting explorations, we call them.
Cool. Yeah, I do. And actually, I mean, like, it's one of those where I keep going, I need to listen to that. And then I see something shiny, or I'm training a new person at work and I can't split my attention that many ways.
That's fair.
And as far as GM Chris, if he talks to you like he talks to us, he's probably still talking on the other end of the call, even though you hung up a month ago. I love Chris. But
yeah, no, the conversation we had with Chris was actually really great. So a lot of the times the conversations with the authors will be about the process they went through in writing the setting, but very often that branches into discussion about setting creation approaches or just creating community content for an actual marketplace and platform and how you do that and create quality. So Chris had some really awesome ideas about playtesting in that conversation. So I recommend listening to that interview just for his input on the best ways to playtest.
Mm-hmm.
For that information alone, it was really cool. We talked a lot about don't just be the GM, but also be a player in your own playtest sessions to see how other people learn how to GM in your content. That was super neat. With Guillaume Tardif, he is a French Canadian, and French is his primary language. So, but he makes his products in English for an English marketplace. So we talked to him about creating content in a second language and sort of the process for that. And there's some really cool tips and tricks that he uses that I think are useful, not just to English as a second language creation, but also just writing in general.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so the conversations have been fantastic. They're not just about the settings with these authors. A lot of times they talk about some the technical detail of just how to actually create content, which has been super rad. And Chris was a great conversation. I was trying to remember why I went into that tangent. And Chris had a lot of really, really cool stuff to say about that. So I think it's definitely worth a listen to at some point.
I find with Chris, I could hear him read a phone book and it would be entertaining.
He would be super excited about it. And you would feel that excitement.
I feel like he would get through it at a surprising pace.
Yes. Yeah.
I feel like he would start and get to the end and you would be like, is that the end?
Well, he'd fit it within the time constraints of a convention game.
Right.
But it would still be very exciting. So
right, exactly.
All right. So I figured, given the theme of your show and some experiences that Steve and I have had personally, we'd bring you on, one, because, well, you have a cool show on the D20 network, and we like to spread people that around. And as it turns out, there was somebody on the Discord last week that was looking for your show because they heard about it on our show, and they were from Russia.
Yeah. Yeah. And they found a way to access the show. I forget how, but apparently all of our distribution channels, because we go through Anchor FM, IP block Russia right now for obvious and very good reasons. But yeah, I don't know how he actually was able to access if he just used a VPN or what. But I'm glad he found how to access it and is enjoying it. At some point, we're going to put it on YouTube too. That's on my to-do list, but we'll see.
Yeah. But anyway, as I was trying to say before I sidetracked myself, we wanted to talk to you about setting expectations, both in the context of when you're playing in maybe one of these Foundry settings, or it's a custom setting of your own, and expectations both in the context of what can your players expect from the setting, but also just setting those expectations of what you expect from your players and your players can expect from you. Because I think, for as wonderful of a toolbox as Genesys specifically is, but even with games like, say, Savage Worlds or any of these other toolbox games, Cortex Prime, whatever, I think it's really easy for a GM to come up with most of a structure, and they have a very clear idea of what they want to do. But if it's not communicated effectively to the rest of the table, then player A thinks it's going to be this, and player B thinks it's going to be this, and so on. And the GM has another idea, and then you try to play, and everyone's kind of half confused and disappointed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think I get what you're saying, and I think that a big part of it too is I hate to say it, but this is also one of those things where it's like session 0 is important. Do a session 0, but I hate to say that because everything boils down when it comes to table interactions. It almost always boils down to you guys should really do a session 0. Like you should just have that moment. But I mean, even a session 0, like if you don't do it, if you don't know what questions to ask and what discussion to have, you can still run into this issue of expectation mismatch, be it in the setting or the tone or whatever you want to do. I mean, even in terms of I think setting, I think they all sort of tie together tightly, but even in terms of like gamist versus narrativist style play, like that all has to be hammered out in that session 0.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's, and I think it's, how do I want to say it? I think, like you said, session 0 goes a long way, but and we were talking a little bit before we recorded that Steve and I were both involved in a game not too long ago where, based on the conversations we had with the GM and conversations that were had in our session 0 and so on, we had one expectation of what the GM wanted to do. And then when we started play, it was something else. And not that it was terribly far removed, but character concepts didn't quite work because of what we had thought we were playing. The themes and so forth. And I don't know how to say it other than I think, you just have to be, and maybe this is, we're talking about maybe just the language and the ways to say things, but, don't kind of go, well, it's this mixed with a little bit of this, because not everyone's going to have the same frame of reference that you do.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Definitely. I think that what you're saying, this idea of describing a setting and this can be effective, but this a little it's kind of like a little bit of A and a little bit of B, and it's A-ish, B-ish. You're like, okay, cool, but that doesn't go a very far distance to setting an expectation, I think, especially in narrative focused games like Genesys, where a lot of emphasis is put on creating a story for your character. I think maybe the question that should be asked for those situations, and this is really on the GM. I mean, I think a lot of this is sort of on the GM to ask, but I also maybe put a little bit excess responsibility on the GM, is to ask the player, what story do you want to tell with your character? And then based on that answer, the GM can gauge where the player's expectations lay. So you don't even really need to get to the like what's the setting. It's more like the setting is, well, that's not true. The setting's important, but equally as important in Genesys in particular, but I think any sort of narrative focused game, so like Powered by the Apocalypse or Blades in the Dark or anything like that, where narrative and fiction are front and foremost, you want to say like, hey, what story are you telling with this character? Is this a sort of a coming of age story or something, or do you want to have like a redemption arc for your character or whatever? Like, what do you want to do? What are the big external pressures that you're really dealing with beyond just like the baddie?
Yeah, I think, and also, that as a player, yeah, you want to communicate that. I think as a GM too, you want to communicate the themes that you're looking to explore in the campaign. Are you looking to do a more action-driven campaign? Are you looking
Right.
to do a lot more investigation? And those are very broad terms too, right? Like, oh, we're doing investigation. Well, does investigation mean heist, breaking and entering stuff, or is it gumshoeing around and a lot of stakeouts and observing?
Sure. And I mean, I think it even goes further than that, like mechanically too. Like, are you investigate? I think investigation games are some of the hardest games to run, actually, because you can have like these like really focused mechanical points, like these event or these incident points in your game that you require very specific things to do, and that approach gets a lot of um, uh, pushback, but I think it's a valid approach. But it also means that like you've made a very gamey game, and it's gonna be really slow in certain regards, and your player should be aware of that. Versus the other type of investigation where it's sort of, oh, you're gonna get the clue you need by the end of this scene, and then you just figure out what that clue is based on what happens in the scene, where it's very free form investigation,
Mhm.
and that has a totally different impact on how your players are expecting to play the game, obviously. So I think that I don't remember what my point was, but it somehow ties into. I think it ties in, like there's like this mechanical aspect too, because you're right. It isn't all like narrative. I think what you were saying is that there's like these mechanical or structural parts of the game that you can end up having an expectation mismatch, and you need to figure out a way to address them. And I think that investigative games in particular have a much higher capacity for structural mismatch.
I would agree. I mean, investigative games, for as much as like I've run some Delta Green, which is based off Call of Cthulhu, is an investigative game. And I mean, based on Steve's comments from when he played it with me, I apparently run it quite narrative, at least compared
Mhm.
to what he was exposed to at the time. But yeah, investigation is weird. And you bring up a valid point there in that investigation, you have to figure out how to give the players clues and be careful you don't paint yourself into a corner by hiding them behind roles. Because, I mean, I've said this before on the podcast, but if you need them to find it out, don't make it something they have to succeed at a roll for, because inevitably that's when everyone will roll like crap. And it's
Mhm.
happened to me after I said that and was just not thinking about it at the time. And there are also, though, I don't know if you've ever done anything with the gumshoe system. That was, I'd say, the last investigative game that I've gotten a chance to play, and Steve ran that. That has a really unique mechanic for that because you don't roll so much as you just spend points.
Interesting. I've heard really good things about it. I haven't dived. Uh, I haven't explored it too deeply yet, but
It's a really interesting system.
Because you're right, because you don't have like any you don't have set. It really embraces like the not having set clues idea, right? Like you sort of come up with the clues on the fly towards where you need to end up going.
Yes, but I it can. When I ran it, I didn't follow that so much as just
Okay.
I had a hunch of I had a good idea of where they were going. It was just a question of how they were getting there. So yeah, you can, and I know it's in the book, and I know that was some of the stuff that I read over. I just sort of was like, that's fine. I'm just gonna, do my own thing because like that's a good idea, but I don't want to confuse them too much.
Yeah, I mean, if that works for you, that works for you too, because I mean that's also a big part of investigative games though too, right? Is that like I think like the necessity to really know your table is higher for investigative games than other game types.
Possibly, yeah.
And getting to know them quickly at least is important. Well,
Right.
and just to sort of circle back around, I feel and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, but I feel like even if you can't get it expressed in your session 0, doing like after session check-ins especially during the early sessions of a campaign is super important to make sure your players are in the expectation or you've set expectations correctly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I will never naysay doing intercession check-ins or after session debriefs or however you wanna label them. But I mean, just ask your players after the session, "Hey guys, did you have fun? What did
Hmm.
you find fun? And what did you find least fun? Or what did you hate? If it, give me feedback."
I usually just go, what's the good, what's the bad, and what's the ugly.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. I think the challenge there is that people don't like giving other people negative feedback. That's
Oh yeah.
it's really hard to get that. And honestly, like I love it when I do like a session debrief and everyone's like, "Oh no, it was great. I loved everything about it." I'm like, "That's cool, but how do I make it better for you?" Like
Hmm.
I know there has to be like there are things I'm doing that aren't meshing or that aren't meshing as well as they could for you, right? So like how do I fix that? And I need to know like tell me I suck and why I suck. I'm fine with
Hmm.
it. And getting your players to do that that's actually really hard. That's like
Mhm.
pulling teeth.
I find myself sometimes I'll focus in on something that I feel like they might have had a problem with and just be like, what did you guys think of this? And that's when they'll go either it wasn't an issue and I was just perceiving role play as like out of character struggle, or it was completely an issue and I finally got them to break through on that issue.
Yeah, yeah, that's yeah. If you can point to something specifically that you know that is maybe not controversial, but like has mixed reactions from your players, like
Hmm.
it's a great way to sort of spur feedback. I have had the situation where like I've done that and the feedback and it like triggers feedback from one player, but then like literally it's totally contrary to like what the other players have how they've responded to it. And I'll admit that like that's I still don't know what to do with those types of situations. 'Cause, like where other than saying like maybe this isn't the table for you. I don't it's you get a weird it's hard to navigate that.
Yeah, I think that's usually the hard answer to that question is it's usually like, okay, well, if this is a major issue for you, maybe this isn't the table for you. But if it isn't a major issue, maybe we can push past this.
Well, I'm reminded of I was listening to Ken and Robin talk about stuff months ago.
No.
Yeah, oh, it's a great podcast, by the way, for anyone that doesn't listen to it. Ken Height, Robin D. Laws. Do I need to say anything more? But they were talking actually specifically about playtesting on this one episode, and they said something that I found interesting, and it was that pay attention to all the feedback you get from your playtesters, but not necessarily how they tell you to fix their perceived problems. And what they
Yeah.
were saying in that, I think, was that they're telling you about a potentially real problem. However, their solution may not be the actual solution.
Yeah. No, I mean I think that's fair. That's I think that's totally right because I mean their solution is going to be one focus on just like their problem in a vacuum,
Mhm.
sort of inherently. Also, if you read like a lot of game development forums and papers and discussions, this is a constant issue that players in video games, and this applies to tabletop RPGs too, I think, don't always necessarily know what's bothering them about something. They think they do, but the trick and the way that you show yourself to be like really good is to like navigate that and like realize, no, okay, this is actually what the issue is, and I can tweak this thing over here to increase your enjoyment of the game. And yeah, I mean, I honestly, I think also in my experience, aside from like really egregious issues like crossing someone's lines or totally obliterating the idea of a veil or something like that, but for the most part, a lot of stuff is solved by just figuring out ways to really engage your players, because I think a lot of what happens is that disengagement manifests in games for players in different ways. So it'll be like, I find this boring, or like, I want to know more about this and not that. And what they're really saying is like, I'm not engaged with what you're giving me right now, and you have to figure out a way to fix that. But I mean, but that's like the core fundamental part of running a game, is engaging your players, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Steve has a fabulous dirty trick for this that it works great for campaign stuff, not so much for one shots. But I tell him this all the time every time he brings it up. But he's really good for when you sit down to start your next session. He'll go, okay, what happened last session? And to me, it's such a beautiful.
It's such a dirty trick. It's so lazy. You don't even know.
As someone who, one of my regular games where I'm a player, does this all the time, where the players are on call to summarize, do the recap of last session. It is a dirty trick, but it is effective.
Oh yeah,
it's a very effective dirty trick.
Yeah. I'm not the note taker. I've never been the note taker of the group. Like when I run games, I take bare minimum notes. I know what's going on. I have everything in my head. That's why I tend to burn out on games that I get too far of a break away from them, and I tend to be like, yeah, I'm kind of burnt out on this because I don't remember where I was going, and that's just a folly on my end. But I love going to my players and being like, all right, what happened last session? Because it tells me what they paid attention to, what they didn't pay attention to. And like if somebody's telling what happened last session and they forgot something that another player really found important, they'll go, well, but what about this?
Yeah, that's actually it. Yeah, you know, at least some portion of your players are engaged and they're correcting each other on the recap.
Yeah. So that's, like you were saying about, the feedback, and unfortunately that doesn't give you the negative feedback. But I think to kind of circle back into the expectations, it's one of those things where it can also let you get a good gauge on, are you conveying what you want to convey with the tone you intended, or are you coming across completely different?
Yeah.
Like the example that sticks in my head, and this will tell some people how old I am, but I remember watching, there was this little, 30-second clip on Sesame Street one time when I was a kid, and it was this alligator walking, and they played it with two different music beds over top of it, and one of them was this sinister, dun dun dun, dread thing, and the other was like this crazy carnival music, and it was funny as heck, and it was the same video. And just to me, that's an example of, you think you're doing one thing, but maybe it's coming across as something else.
Sure.
And like you were saying about, getting the feedback can help if you're giving the information that you intend to give.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of ways for how to integrate that into, because ideally you want to like nip that in the bud before you even get to session 1, right? So how do you do that in between session 0 and session 1, other than doing the session 0, right? Because the assumption here being that in session 0 you've already had that miscommunication happen, where the players are expecting, or some players are expecting, something different than what the GM is anticipating.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if just having this simple question from the GM and have the players like email it to them or something, like, so they have time to think about it and write to them afterwards, say, what are you most excited about for the upcoming session? And that, I think, might go a long way to, I mean, if their expectations are already off kilter, then the GM's kind of in a bind. They might need to readjust. But I don't know, whatever, man. Like, that's the job of the GM. Like, think on your feet. So do it is my advice. But I think that might be like the only way I can really think of to sort of address that like session 0, session 1 communication gap that can happen.
No, I think though that's actually a very good suggestion. Especially considering we're all on Discord, email, etc. constantly anymore. But have that conversation individually with your players about hey, what are you looking forward to? Because this has happened to me at least twice, where I went into a session 0 with one concept in mind, and then we have our session 0 and the players go, or you mutually come up with where the players do it and you just sort of ride the wave, where they go, yeah, we're going to do this other thing instead of the thing you were thinking about. And you're going, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. I want to do that. But now half of the pre-planning I had already done just went out the window.
Well, the real answer to that is don't plan. It's don't ever make plans as a GM. Yeah.
Bullet points and put them in a different gun. But yeah,
exactly.
I'm the Star Wars game that we're currently playing, we were going to do this thing where they were going to be, scavengers and scrappers and so forth. And everyone thought that was a pretty cool idea. We'd been, messaging back and forth. Then we sit down and have a session 0. They decide they want to be a pod racing team, which I'm completely on board with because it's no secret to most of I'm a bit of a gearhead, right? So racing, I'm like, oh, sure, yeah. Then I start looking. There's like one little blurb in one book about pod racing and all of the Star Wars RPG material. It's like, well, shoot.
That's an opportunity for you to create an entirely new system for Star Wars RPG that you can't share publicly because Disney
you
might
can
come after you.
Share it publicly. You just can't make money off of it. But anyway,
well,
but or another. I was going to try and run a game at one point with one theme in a given, let's call it a given setting, and I had a pretty solid concept of what I wanted to do. So we go to have session 0, and Steve was there, and it changed from being this kind of paramilitary expedition to a bunch of college film students going to make a documentary in the same location.
Okay.
And like it just went, well, okay, how do I readjust my pieces? Because the enthusiasm the players are showing for this is really high. It works in the context of what I want to do, but I have to approach it differently. And unfortunately, that game never made it any farther than the session. Well, we did play like a session 1, but then it fell apart due to scheduling and time zones and all those things, and us deciding that
I completely forgot about that.
that I really wanted to do it in Genesys instead of the system hack that we had found, and I haven't got a chance to rework all the things I need to rework for Genesys to do it yet. But anyway.
Sure.
Because I figured out a way around the IP restrictions, but, we'll get to that eventually. But that was, like I said, we had the session 0, and I got, from the players, I get this other idea that, well, okay, this works, but now I have to restructure things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, in that case, it wasn't an issue because we all had a very concrete reference point of what we were doing as far as a physical setting. But it was the lens through which we were viewing it that got moved. And I don't know, I guess in that case, it very much helped that we had a very defined physical setting. And I think, where some games may run is if you're defining your setting as a mix of, Batman and Into the Badlands, just to throw two somewhat dissimilar things out there. Yeah. But that probably means 3 different things to the 3 of us in this conversation.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's more of an issue of when you're using other IPs as your sort of mapping for what your setting, your original setting is like. Maybe just don't do that.
Okay.
Just don't use that. Use them as inspiration, but don't use them as the reference point to describe to your players because you're saying something like Into the Badlands and Batman is. I could totally see someone saying that too, and I'm what the hell does that mean?
I mean,
Western ninjas with bat costumes.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something there, though. When you say, "What the hell does that mean?" I think you just need to respond back with that. Like, maybe not
Yeah.
in that tone, but I think if somebody does throw that pitch at you, you go, "What does that? What do you mean? What do you mean? Please elaborate." Because
Excuse me. What do you mean by that? There's the tone.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, yeah. No, but that, I mean, the players certainly should ask that. But I think also as a GM too, that take inspiration from other media. Obviously, I mean, you can't not take inspiration from other media. That's just how our brains work, right? But when you are doing the elevator pitch to your players, try and ignore the fact that the other media exists entirely, and just describe it as a new thing. And then afterwards, like, and what I'm saying is, it's Batman meets Into the Badlands.
Mhm.
But before that, you should have like a very long preamble that takes 5 minutes to describe, that is about your original verbiage describing your setting, which is a lot of work, but good GMing is a lot of work. So
I think that kind of gets to maybe kind of the point of what, at least in my brain, was the whole intent of this conversation, is, right, is how do you accurately convey what you're thinking to your players without a string of confusing or potentially confusing half references.
sure. Well, I think that's part of that issue is how definite are you with your setting, right? So if
Mhm.
you're at the point where the only way that you can describe the setting you're going to do is to make these sort of referential mappings to existing media, and you don't really have anything nailed down beyond that, that might be a really good indicator that, not that you don't have a setting, and not that you're not ready to play in this world, but that your players might have a lot more input into developing the setting
Mhm.
than you had initially thought. At which point you say, "This is kind of what I'm I'm thinking I want to do Into the Badlands plus Batman plus 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a lot of leagues under the sea." Uh,
And some deadball just for fun.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then and then your players will say, "I don't know what any of that means. That sounds super cool. You're excited. I'm on board. Let's do this." And then you'll realize, oh, you're not able to really succinctly describe what that all boils down to. So then you say to your players, "Okay, cool. So what setting exactly do you want out of this?"
yeah, I've done a little bit of that myself, and then sometimes I'll just go, sometimes, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but just a little bit more. Sometimes you run into these tonal issues where the game's been running for a while, and maybe you're losing the plot, or you're not fully following where you originally wanted to go. And so what I'll do a lot of times, especially with setting, is let my players. I go to my players and be like, okay, what does this look like? How are you communicating with them? What, just try and get the tone back in your head as the GM to be like, especially from the players, because you need to keep in mind as the GM, it's the best laid plans of mice and men, right? Like,
Mhm.
if your players are on a completely different wavelength and you're into a longer campaign, you might have to just get on that wavelength if you want to keep playing, or I don't know, maybe it's time to end this one and move on to the next one, right? But I do a lot of times go to my players and be like, describe to me this, how are you talking to them? What does this room look like? Where are you heading next? You just try to ask the questions that lead the players to building the setting for you.
Yeah. I think for me, part of the problem for me, and I'm just going myself personally, is that I have a lot of, let's call it, mental free time where I can think about things a lot. And I can't necessarily write them down as I'm thinking them. And so I tend to kind of group these thoughts into, what do you want to say, like bullet pointed documents in my head, right?
Mhm.
And so then also, I'm not a great typist. So when I get a chance to write things down, if I write it in handwriting, half the time I can't read it 2 weeks later. And also, it's like, now I've got these bullet points and I know what I meant by them, but I can't always figure out how to how to say it in a way that other people are going to understand what I mean.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah.
Communication, I guess, but
Well, I think it is a lot of just from what you're saying, it sounds like it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of just trying to. Sometimes you just have to say what's in your head and hope that people understand what you're saying. I feel
yeah.
like
Well, I guess from that though, if you're a player in one of these, be it session 0 or campaign, don't be afraid to ask questions, because that can only help you, more clearly understand what the GM is going for. I don't know. And I guess maybe some of it is, and I'm sort of realizing this for myself, and that many times maybe I think I have more of a concrete idea than I do.
mhm,
And that may be a failing on
Sure.
my part, that, well, I've got an idea in my head, I can't convey that idea effectively to the table. And maybe that's where, I don't know if other people struggle like that or too or not, but I think that actually could probably lead to a lot of confusion where we've all got a fairly concrete idea in our head, but they're not the same idea. And because we think we understand, we're not asking questions, and therein lies the state of perpetual confusion.
I think that's a good name for the podcast, by the way.
State of perpetual confusion. It's a good
At
name for
least for the
your
episode.
punk band spin-off from the podcast.
Oh man,
Don't tempt us like that.
just a whole group of rocker boys and oh. Anyways, sorry. I've got my brain on Cyberpunk 2020 recently because I got to play some back at the beginning of October, and it's really got me like, oh, I could go for this.
That's a good.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I didn't even
before we get into that, any final thoughts on anything on all this conversation we've been having?
Yeah, I mean, session 0, folks. That's what it comes down to. that's I mean, it always back down to session 0, but I do think that what you're really getting at, and what is sort of like the crux of the issue here, is that session 0 isn't like a one and done thing. You do session 0, and then you have your debriefs, and maybe you have a session 0.5, just like check-in discussion, individually with your players. And then, I mean, you want to keep calibrating continuously. GMing well is continuously calibrating your performance, because it's a performative activity, to your players, and that's an ongoing process.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, with all that being said, where can people find you? Where would you like to be found, if you'd like to be found, or
Do you want to hide under a rock and we won't tell anyone where you are?
Where would I like to be found? Yeah, I mean, somewhere on the coast of Maine in my own cabin. That'd be great. But
what are you, a Stephen King character?
no, I'm just a tired millennial on the East Coast. um, so maybe Stephen King character. I don't know,
probably. Actually, were you ever hit by
the
a
one
car?
that dies early?
Were you ever hit by a vehicle? Because if you were hit by a vehicle, you're definitely a Stephen King character.
It might actually have died. So
Yeah.
who knows? No, yeah. Where can you find me? You can find me, like we said at the top of the episode, I am a co-host of the Table Flip podcast, and that means that as a D20 Radio Network podcast, you can find me on the D20 Radio Network Discord, and we use our own little Table Flip channel there to discuss with listeners. I'm also pretty active on the Genesys community Discord server, where we talk about Genesys and complain about the same silly stuff day in and day out. But every now and then, there's some useful nuggets that pop out of those conversations. So if you're into Genesys, I strongly recommend you check it out. I do not do other social media. I don't tweet. I don't toot. I don't Facebook. I don't Instagram. So you'll have to find me on Discord. Every now and then I might post something on the Genesys subreddit or something under Swine Flu Shmoo. But that's about it.
Okay.
I'm always happy to hear feedback from people. So on stuff I've released or recorded. So feel free to hit me up.
Say on that subject, I know you've also got a number of releases out on the Genesys Foundry that you've written or contributed to. If you'd care to share any of
Yeah,
those with people.
sure. So I designed and wrote the Genesis Organizations, Legions, and Enterprises Management System, aka as Golems. That is a faction management system that sort of works with the narrative dice system in Genesis and is loosely inspired by Stars Without Number and its faction management systems there, but also there's a few other things that inspired it. I also am the author of, let's see, I Declare, which is a structured, adjudicated social encounters. So it's for if you want to do a trial scene where you have a judge that you're trying to convince, or a battle of the bands, or something where you have like an adjudicator and your opponent and an opponent, and you're trying to convince the adjudicator before the opponent does. So I Declare covers that. I also have released Untethered Minds, which is, for lack of a better term, a sanity system, sort of Call of Cthulhu-esque sanity system for Genesis. I am very explicit that I don't call it sanity in that because I think that's sort of a crappy term to use. It is a dissociation system and gets into, it covers all the same ground though. And that's for Genesis as well, and fits within their dice system and talent system actually. And then as far as adventure content, I made a splat called Island Adventures, which is a Golem's Adventure Seed Packet, as I call it. Basically, it's a large region with a bunch of detailed adventure hooks and seeds. And also released recently a product called Acadito with Scarpy, actually, Kyle Sharp, who was on your podcast relatively recently.
Yeah.
And it is a Android setting Golem's Adventure Seed packet. I dare to say one of the coolest things I've released, and is actually really beautifully produced. So I'm actually super proud of it. All of those are pay what you want. With that said, I am happy if you pay me money. So even 50 cents helps, because DriveThruRPG doesn't track free downloads. It tracks it, but it doesn't track it for performance metrics. So if you download any of that and like it, kick me 50 cents just so that it gets some tracking on DriveThruRPG, and maybe rate and review. But yeah, that's what I've released. So
Cool. So just because it's something that I should have thought of before, but you mentioned, that you're moderately active on the Genesis community Discord, and I'm a member over there. I just don't have the time to keep up with the post flow.
sure.
At least not currently, because, well, my employer would take a dim view of that. Let's put it that way.
I'm a terribly inefficient employee.
But in the context of settings, are there any, and I'm not trying to pick on any settings work, but are there any questions in regards to settings that you hear come up on the Genesis Discord that seem to come up repeatedly?
Sure. I mean, I'm not gonna finger point any settings in particular, I don't think, but I will say, yeah, there are certain settings that continue to have issues. What I actually see a lot of, well, aside from some settings that just like need more work and thought put into them, and those should be relatively apparent if you look at the reviews and comments for them, actually.
Hmm.
But also, what I see not a lot of it, but what I see every now and then are settings that clearly weren't originally intended for Genesis and were put into Genesis not necessarily as an afterthought, but without a lot of thought behind it.
Hmm.
So, and those tend to have some of the biggest issues, just because, frankly, the time doesn't. That means the time wasn't put into playtesting and thinking about it, because playtesting doesn't necessarily mean like sitting down with a bunch of players. I mean, that's great. That's ideal if you playtest with a bunch of players, but playtest as it is typically used also includes basically intensive proofreading and just having other people sit down and read your stuff and think about the mechanics you're proposing and say, hey, this doesn't make any sense, or this is fantastic, I like it, and then iterating based on that feedback. It's just having review and other and more eyes. And the afterthought ports have the issue where it's like they don't get those eyes on them, and sometimes it's clear that the authors don't entirely understand Genesis as a system, and maybe you just need to sit down and think a little bit harder about how the narrative dice and the narrative dice system interacts with what they're proposing in their material.
Okay. So, in short, maybe if you're doing this, think about some of the mechanics and how that reinforces what you're trying to do with the setting.
Yeah. Yeah, and remember that Genesis is a narrative setting. It is or a system. It is a fiction first, heavily cinematic narrative play system. So when you are designing things, you don't need to go crazy simulationist. You don't need to simulate every teeny itty bitty little thing. You need to create things that encourage cool stuff happening and encourage the players imagining cool stuff. So I don't know. That's not a very that doesn't give like really concrete action items, but I think that sometimes people get, because the kind of person who wants to make a setting splat is also the kind of person that probably likes tinkering with systems and likes, pulling levers and tweaking this and that. But you don't have to do that constantly for something that's like narrative focused. You just need to create a lot of flavor and then lightly touch what needs to be touched so that it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, and again, I'll speak a little bit from some of the traps I find myself with, is that you go, oh, it's a narrative system, so we'll just handle that narratively. Yes, but you need to make sure that it's being handled the way that you need it to for your themes to come through right.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, well, so yeah, maybe I should walk back what I just said a little bit. So you are right. So keep in mind that everything is in Genesis, at least, is really oriented towards a narrative cinematic end, but the means to get there still need to be mechanically sound to support that end. So one thing that and this actually, you know what, this actually ties into our earlier discussion about like expectations, right? Is that a good setting, the best settings in my mind, not necessarily a good setting, but the best settings, and they all share a strong narrative focus. There's a theme that they are exploring. Maybe they're exploring transhumanism. Maybe they're exploring depersonalization. Maybe they're exploring community or cooperating across barriers or whatever. They have one, two, three, a small handful maybe of these core narrative themes that sort of carry the fiction forward, and then the mechanics support those focuses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you should think of the mechanics supporting those focuses. And they should support them in that they just make the players think about them in a narrative and effective manner. But you don't, again, I still don't want people to think that like you need to go in and like engineer every teeny little number and thing, like every granula has to be simulated so that you're basically running a video game. That's because that's not what it's about. But you do want to have your mechanics sort of poke the player in the brain in the right way to make them say, oh yeah, this is sort of like my this setting that's all about the dehumanization aspect of transhumanism is all about my character losing their personal understanding of their body or something. And it's like, oh cool, this is cool how cybernetics are doing this. Maybe they're reducing strain or something like that. Like there's it's stuff like that that sort of like pokes your players in the brain in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a point here, and not to dive back into it, but I think this gets to something where I've realized, because let's be honest, we all know Star Wars and Genesis are very closely related.
Sure.
One of the biggest difference being the talent system, where Star Wars has these defined talent trees, Genesis uses the pyramid. And tell me if you think I'm wrong, but I think that as a GM, if you're creating a setting either to publish or to just to play at your home table, you actually want to put some thought into what talents you allow in the game. Because what the talent trees in Star Wars do is they allow the different specializations to very much emulate different tropes that we see in the Star Wars media. Whereas Genesis being very much freeform, we can't make up those much more rigid trees, or they can't in the core books because they don't know what you're doing. And while I'm not saying that everyone should go to the work of creating full-blown talent trees for their Genesys setting, having some restriction as to, hey, no, we're not using this talent. And I know there's guidelines in some of the books regarding this, but I think that's something that might actually bear more attention than at least some people give it. And certainly for your own personal homebrew games, something you want to think about maybe a little more deeply in that, because then your focus, what the talent trees do is they focus the attention of the players in the direction that the game wants them to go in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, 100%. So I think a good way to think about Genesys as a system, or the character sheet, is that the skills show you the skills are how you play the game, right? Because they are how you cooperate with the game. The talents are how you break the game and break the rules and really define your character, because that's like the heroic things and that's even true in Star Wars, right? Because the heroic things that you see happen in Star Wars is, when people do things extraordinarily unusual and sort of break the rules of the game within the cinematic universe or the narrative universe or whatever, the books and comics too. So the way that you're breaking the game is directly tied into like what themes are you exploring and what tone do you have in the game. So yeah, your talents are like critical for a proper setting document. You can't just like slap random talents in there. You have to be really thoughtful about what talents you have. If you want to have, a pulpy noir game, you get stuff like the hard-boiled talent, right? Where the name of the talent itself is sort of just oozing flavor and narrative content. Or if you want to do sci-fi and something with like ships and space opera, then you'll pick a whole bunch of like piloting talents, because that's the pilot doing crazy things to save the day is a staple of good space opera and good space-based sci-fi. So you want to have those talents to like break the rules a little bit and give those players opportunities to do something cool with the setting and tone. So yeah, for sure. So yeah, think about your talents. Absolutely. I'm not a big fan of talent trees, I'll say. I'll just put that out there. I think they're super restrictive, and they don't. I understand the appeal. I really like pushing my players to be as creatively engaged with my games as possible, though, and I think that talent trees are antithetical to that, because they just say like, okay, go down the tree and you do the thing in the tree. But what Genesys does allow for, well, Genesys allows for talent trees, first off. So if you disagree with me, you can be like, shut up, Micah, I'm going to do talent trees anyway. And I'm like, okay, cool, whatever, I don't care. But if you want to do something that's sort of like as a middle ground, suggested talent builds for careers. So some of the later first-party products from Fantasy Flight Games, now Edge, have that in, I think, Android. Shadow of the Beanstalk has it, and I'm pretty sure that Secrets of the Crucible has it, where it's like a suggested like mini pyramid, like your first half dozen talents should look like this maybe, and you can just like work through that as it's kind of like a tree. And those are usually like really thematically constructed, and that's another really good way of like sort of communicating setting and theme too, is just by you have your archetype, you have your career, and then you have these suggested talent starter build outs, and that is like, okay, cool. This is the face character, and the face is kind of like a schmoozy con man. So like, there's a lot of like scheming and shady business going on, because your face is a scammer, is a con artist, right? Or heavy fighter guy is maybe some law-abiding person, right? It's a paladin is your heavy fighting guy, and they have build outs that sort of focus on that. So like that is another thing that informs your players what to expect from the setting, I think.
All right, so I think we've maybe re-diverged enough for there. I did want to bring up too, just because I have a copy of it and they're friends of the show, and it has some steps that work through some of the stuff we've been talking about here. On the Foundry, there's a product from Studio 404, Brett, Phil, and company, called Setting Notebook, which is,
oh yeah,
it's pay what you want, I believe, but it's very neatly done, and it is done like a workbook, and has creating tropes, select genre, established tech level, steps to go through. Again, I don't think even they would probably tell you don't have to follow it word for word, but it gives you a lot of prompts to think about these things. And I dare say you could use this to create a setting regardless of what game system you were going to play it in, even though it's intended for Genesys. So just a little plug for our friends there and the Foundry and all that. All right.
Cool. Yeah, it is a good product.
Are you muted, Steve?
I am muted, Steve.
Ah.
And I was going to say on that bombshell, let's move into Game of the Week.
Woohoo! Game of the week.
Game of the week. Game of the week.
All right. Who's going first?
I can go first.
You going to go first? All right.
Yeah. So we gave you a little bit of a rundown on how this works, Micah.
Mm.
So my game for this week is, man, this is cool and cheap. It's all of $6. It's a game called Chum, CHUM, and it's a lightweight roll and play social tabletop game about being lost at sea and surviving a shark attack. And I don't know. I think this is a great idea. It's a game that's really made for like one shots. They say it's zero prep, snappy one shots, fun, intense. I'm kind of down for just throw it on the table and be like, here, look, let's all be shark attack victims for a minute. Like something like what is it? Was it Deep Blue Sea? Was that the movie? Or any of those
Yeah,
shark movies really?
I think Deep Blue Sea was the one with the underwater lab, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
LL Cool J and Thomas Jane were in it,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or what was the 47 meters down, which was the one they were trapped in a shark cage? Was that
I
it?
think that was a
No,
like,
I don't
historically
know.
based.
I don't know.
I can think of the one you're talking about, but I can't remember the title.
I think it is 47 meters down. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they travel to Mexico for a fun vacation and end up trapped in shark-infested waters. Yep, that's the one I was thinking of.
Okay.
2017.
This can cover everything like that, though. It can cover sort of adrift on a raft to
Yeah,
a sci-fi setting. So
yeah, you could even that would be wild. But
it sounds super cool. I mean, I like the idea of like a stranded at sea type shark game. For some reason, even though this seems like according to the little blurb here, it's based on this hope panic mechanic.
Right.
That still sounds like a really quiet night in type game to me.
It kind of does.
Like, you're all like, we're just gonna play a game about being like stuck on a raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and there's sharks and we might get eaten.
I think it's the game that you bring. Like, I think it's the game that you bring to the table when the GM can't make it that week.
Yeah.
Right. Like all the players can be there, and it's like, oh, I still want to play something. Because it's like, this is my, Wednesday night. Can we still play something and like throw that down on a table and just run it?
I wonder if the hope mechanic works kind of like the Criminal and Bear and Honey Heist.
I don't know. I can't speak to how it works, but
yeah, well, I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah,
I just picked this up, so I will be checking this out at some point.
Yeah, and it's so expensive. It's all of $6.
Yeah, successful game of the week.
Yeah.
Well, I also don't cash out any of the money I make on the Foundry. Because I don't want to have to deal with like taxes for like $200. So this is just like Foundry money going into this.
All right. Well, who wants to go next?
Say, I've got one.
If there are no takers, I'll pick somebody.
You cold call us. I'm back at school.
All right. Well, I'll go next then. The heck with it. All right. So I can't match you for cheapness.
Yeah.
But just the theme of this game makes it interesting to me. Whether or not it's well executed, I don't know. But there is a free quick start you can get, though. So that's always an option. But my game of the week is a game, and hopefully I'm going to pronounce this right. It is Tian Shang Lone Wolf Fists. Let me put a link to you guys in the...
I got it here.
It describes itself as the world's preeminent post-apocalyptic kung fu action game.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Which, I mean, let's be honest. The blurb doesn't tell you a whole lot. The previews don't show a whole lot. They want $25 for the PDF. It's over 300 pages. It says it has rules that not only allow but encourage you to punch a tank in half, battle a scorpion demon, or fight an entire army with your bare hands.
This just sounds like you're trying to play Rifts again, Steve.
Well, maybe. I don't know.
I'm just picking up. No, this seems really cool.
The concept seems great.
Yeah.
It might only be good for I don't know. I'm not saying it's not good, but it could be just fun to pick up and then port it into Genesys or Savage Worlds or whatever your system of choice is. But I'm sorry, post-apocalyptic kung fu action sounds like a good time to me. Like a
That sounds
fun
like an awesome
Saturday night.
mashup. Yeah.
Add Antebellum, and you have Into the Badlands.
Well, there's that too.
that goes
Yeah,
back
you
to the running
basically could
gag.
just do it. Yeah. Into
That
the
goes
Badlands
back to
instead.
yeah. We had this running gag early on that
Before the podcast started, that one of us needs to build a RPG for Into the Badlands, but neither of us have done it yet.
yeah. Like I said, we'll just add Antebellum to this, and it'll be perfect.
So yeah, that's mine. Like I said, that's Tian Shang, I guess. TIANSHANG : Lone Wolf Fist. The quick start. Hang on, I had it on another tab, and I of course closed that tab. The quick start, I believe, is just called Lone Wolf Fist. Yeah, Lone Wolf Fist quick start. Blood from God's Eye.
All right.
So that's mine.
This does look cool though. Yeah, so I think has anyone done the Quiet Year yet?
No.
I
Oh,
don't
really?
think. I don't
That's
know.
crazy to me. I mean, okay. That was gonna be like, I guess the Quiet Year is my game of the week then.
Okay.
I was gonna suggest some other ones, but if no one's suggested the Quiet Year yet, the Quiet Year is phenomenal. And speaking of games that like you can just like sit down and have like a chill night playing, the Quiet Year is one of those games. Basically, it is a map building game that it's GM-less, and it's kind of GM-less. There's like a lead, but it's like softly GM'd, and then you all just like sit around the table and build up a map, and I think draw cards. It's been a while since I played it, and that sort of determines how you add things to the map and like what problems you face, and you just play through a year in this tiny little town that you've created and see if they survive the year before the end of the Quiet Year ends.
That sounds very, and I know this is going to like sound a little bit morbid, but that sounds very relaxing.
No, it is. It is super relaxing. I absolutely adore that game. I suggest everyone try it. It might not even cost any money. It might be free. I don't know. If it does cost money, it's a few
currently
bucks.
$8 on drive-through. Yeah.
It is worth $8 for sure.
Yeah.
It's something you can sit down with 3-4 of your friends and just have like this, like throw on some cool music, have some neat lighting, and just like play through this game for a couple hours. It's awesome. It's phenomenal. It's some of the best RPG sessions I've had.
Well, and then at the end of it, you have a map.
Yeah, and at the end of it, you have a map that you drew, and it will be a wildly terrible map because all of you are drawing on it. So surely, you are all not going to be good at drawing. So, but it is phenomenal. So yeah, and also you can. So what I've seen people do is they play this, and then they use this as like the basis for the setting of their like full-on campaign that they do.
Yeah.
That's what Adventure Zone did, I think.
Oh, yeah.
in Their last season.
Okay.
Yeah. I could see doing this with a group of players I've never played with before as a way to get a barometer of how they react to things. That would be great. And then you have that, so a little bit of your buy-ins already there because the players have a personal attachment with the actual map setting itself.
Yeah.
I mean, what I like about it too is that it's like a community. So like you're not like you're tied to the characters insofar as that like you're running a community, like you're playing a community of people, which is super cool.
Okay.
But I also like the idea of like I really want to see more games where like you're not playing a particular character, you're just like sort of playing a community of people surviving something and like really focus on that community aspect. Quietly is the only thing I've seen that really does that. I would love to see like a game. I keep wanting to do a game called Caravan Story as a Genesys version of that, just about like a group of like people migrating over the course of a season or something, and just like creating a story of their migration path. And like I don't know, like games like that I think are super cool. Like I find them super cozy.
Well, yeah, it's on par with like Wander Home for that type of like finding your way back, super cozy game. There needs to be somebody needs to And I don't know who, it's not me, but somebody needs to come up with a term for these type of games.
I think cozy
What?
gaming.
Yeah, cozy. Yeah, that's a good term for it.
I know Wanderhome, the creator refers to as a lyric game.
Yeah.
I don't think I know Wanderhome.
Oh, you should definitely check out Wanderhome.
Yeah, I'm
J
checking it out.
Dragon is fantastic, and that's a J Dragon game, and it's amazing.
Oh, this is super cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
Art is
It's
super rad. I love this
it-
art. Oh my god.
yeah, no, right?
Yeah, that's been game of the week before.
Oh,
Another one
yeah.
that, given what you just said, it's not so much cozy, but I think it plays strongly into the community stuff you were just talking about. There's a game got brought up on Game of the Week a while back called Noirlandia, and
Yeah.
I think it's only available on itch.
Okay.
But it's a GM-less sort of investigation game, but you build the setting and everything at the table for the session.
Okay.
Yeah, really cool
It's
game.
different.
That's super rad. Yeah, I really do like those things where you sort of like iterate live on the setting and like develop it sort of with your player. Like the game is making the setting and making the world. I think is super fun.
But like I think, like your suggestion there, the quiet year, to go back to what we were talking about all night, right? If you build your setting, so to speak, you kind of guide your players through the quiet year as a pre-session 0, and then go, okay, now let's create characters and play in this world.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
that
yeah.
I mean, I think that's actually something that a lot of people do now with the quiet year, is that they use it as like their like session -1 sort of, and then they go from there because they built this little community and stuff. They maybe tweak it a little because the quiet year doesn't really lend itself super well to like continuing the community afterwards. But I think that's really common use. I also just picked up Wanderhome too, so this has been a very successful game of the week.
You're just not gonna be back on the podcast for a while. Like, this podcast cost me too much money.
Yeah. Hit my wallet hard. No, I'm super intrigued by Wanderhome. Like just the art that's on the page.
Oh yeah. It's gorgeous.
Absolutely freaking love.
It's that, it's very very whimsical children's novel type art.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like the kind of game that I'd want to play with my kid when he's like a couple years older, when he's like 5 or 6 maybe. I don't know if it actually is, but
no,
the art makes me think it might be.
A lot of people have described it as like, are you familiar? I don't know how much you're into like animation and stuff. Are you familiar with like Over the Garden Wall?
No.
Okay, it's sort of a it's not an adult animated series, but it's a very serious animated series.
Okay.
But gorgeous art. Oh man, Over the Garden Wall. That's a recommendation. If you haven't seen that, I would recommend watching that out. It's on HBO right now, I think. If it survived the purge.
Oh, perfect. I'll have to find it. I mean, if it's pretty enough art, my kid's not old enough to understand what's going on. So.
Yeah, but with all that being said, we want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. This was super fun.
Yeah, as always, links to everything are in our show notes. And we want to remind everyone to be kind to one another and get out there and play some RPGs.
Yep. Take care, y'all.
Peace.
Intro and outro music by the band 12 Noon. You can email us at meandsteverpg@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at @andrpgs. Find us on Facebook at Me and Steve RPG Podcast, on Discord at Me and Steve RPGs, and as always, all of these links are in the show notes. Thank you, and be kind to one another.
How much for the cigar?
Cigar, $20, dog. You gotta go down the street to the store and buy that.
Say on that subject, I know you've also got a number of releases out on the Genesys